Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into one of the harshest winters ever recorded in American history. A season that tested every ounce of human strength and endurance. The story is called The Hard Winter of 1880. How Dakota settlers endured months of snow and hunger. If you enjoy stories like this, please don't forget to give this video a like and hit follow so you never miss the next journey we take together. Now, let's step back to the Dakota Territory in the late 19th century. Imagine a land where the prairie stretched forever, wide and untamed, and the sky seemed to have no end. The settlers thought they knew winter. They had survived blizzards before, patched leaky cabins, rationed food when supplies ran low. But the winter of 1880 was different. It didn't arrive gently, and it didn't leave when it should have. It settled in and refused to let go. The first snow came before families had even finished storing their harvest. At first, it was beautiful soft flakes, falling in silence, blanketing the fields, frosting the fences, giving children a playground. But within days, the snow piled higher. Winds screamed louder, and drifts swallowed fences, barns, and wagon tracks. Cabins disappeared under white walls. Families carved tunnels just to reach barns or neighbors, crawling through the cold darkness as the wind roared overhead. Inside, every cabin became a fortress against the storm. Fires burned around the clock, but the cold still crept in through every crack. Frost spread across windows like lace. Buckets of water froze solid, even near the stove, and sometimes ice formed on blankets while children slept. Each breath hung in the air, a pale cloud floating above their heads. Survival shrank to the basics. Keep the fire alive, keep the family warm, stretch the food as far as it could go. Meals turned small and simple. Cornmeal porridge watered down with melted snow. Beans boiled into thin stews. Salt pork sliced thinner and thinner until it barely covered a plate. Coffee was brewed so weak it tasted more like hot water. A single loaf of bread might be divided into tiny portions, each piece softened by the fire, so it could be chewed slowly and last longer. Mothers reassured their children that spring would come, that the land always gave back. But in their own hearts, they counted the jars and sacks on the shelves with growing dread. And yet, for all its cruelty, the prairie still gave moments of wonder. On clear nights, the sky opened wide. Stars glimmered like lanterns strung across infinity. Sometimes, the northern lights shimmered faintly pink and green curtains, swaying above the endless snow. Families would step outside for just a moment, their faces stung by the cold, but their hearts lifted by the reminder that beauty still existed, even in the hardest of times. Children, as they always do, found ways to turn misery into play. They dug tunnels into snowdrifts, carved forts and castles, and laughed as their voices echoed across the still air. They traced patterns with sticks, caught snowflakes on their tongues, and pulled each other on makeshift sleds cobbled together from scraps of wood. Their joy reminded their parents of something essential. No matter how bitter the storm, life had to include laughter, or else the spirit would break. But the storm never really let up. Families lay awake at night, listening as the wind hammered their walls and pulled at their roofs, as if the land itself were testing their strength. Snow rose so high that some had to cut holes in their roofs to crawl outside. Every morning began with the same silent question: Can we make it through another day? The hard winter of 1880 was more than cold. It was endless hunger, gnawing silence, and white horizons without end. But it was also resilience. Fathers hauling wood through waist-deep drifts, mothers dividing bread crumb by crumb, children huddling under patchwork quilts, stitched with scraps of brighter days, and, through it all, neighbors trading what little they had, sharing kindness as if it were fuel for survival. That is how they endured, not only with food or fire, but with each other. As November turned into December, the snow no longer felt like a passing storm. It became the air they breathed, the ground they walked on, the horizon they saw in every direction. The prairie had vanished beneath a white sea, and the waves of it kept rising. Every few days, another blizzard rolled in, each one worse than the last. The sky would darken, winds would roar, and the world outside the cabin doors became a swirling chaos. People learned to tie ropes from their doors to the barn so they wouldn't vanish into the storm and lose their way just a few feet from home. More than one settler, trying to fetch firewood or water, was swallowed by the snow and never found until spring thawed the prairie. Inside, life shrank tighter. Families gathered around the stove, quilts stacked on shoulders, boots never far from reach in case the roof groaned too loudly. They patched walls with mud, cloth, even stuffed rags into gaps where icy air slipped through. Every log of wood burned too quickly, and every time the stove dimmed, fear crept into the room. Fire was survival, and its crackle was a sound more precious than any music. Food became a game of invention. Dried apples boiled into thin broth, flour stretched into biscuits as flat as paper. A small piece of pork fat, used again and again just to flavor a pot of beans. Some settlers saved seeds meant for planting, grinding them into coarse meal to feed hungry children. Coffee was gone for many by Christmas, and instead families brewed drinks from roasted barley or chicory. Hunger was no longer a quiet ache. It shaped the days, slowed the steps, and made the smallest treat, a spoonful of honey, a bit of jam, feel like a feast. Parents gave up their portions so children could eat. Neighbors walked miles through snow just to trade a handful of onions for flour, or a strip of dried venison for beans. Kindness was currency, and generosity was often the only thing keeping the family alive. But even as hunger grew, the settlers found strength in small rituals. Letters arrived rarely, carried by riders who braved the white wilderness, and each piece of paper became treasure. Families gathered around the fire, reading news from faraway siblings or friends. Words of encouragement, prayers, or even a pressed flower tucked inside gave hope that life beyond the snow was still moving forward. At night, when the blizzards howled, children pressed closer to their parents, listening to stories of summers long past green fields, running rivers, and skies free of ice. Quilts became more than warmth. They became shields of memory, stitched with scraps from brighter days. Each patch carried a story, a dress worn to a wedding, a shirt torn in harvest, a blanket carried from the east. Wrapped inside, children fell asleep not only in cloth but in history, in love carried forward stitch by stitch. The prairie outside was brutal, yet within each cabin there flickered a stubborn flame of humanity. They could not control the sky, nor stop the endless storms, but they could hold each other close, share the last piece of bread, and keep the fire alive through the night. Because survival in that hard winter wasn't only about enduring hunger. It was about refusing to let the cold erase who they were. By January, the settlers realized this winter was not just hard, it was merciless. Snow had piled so high that fences disappeared. Barns looked like small bumps in a white ocean, and even the tallest trees seemed buried to their shoulders. The prairie, normally endless in its openness, now pressed inward like a frozen prison. The days were short, the nights longer than anyone could remember. Darkness fell before supper and lingered far into morning, stretching the hours of cold into something that felt eternal. Families lived by firelight, every flicker of flame reminding them how thin the line was between survival and disaster. Cabins groaned under the weight of snow. Winds clawed at roofs, testing every nail and timber. More than one family woke to the crash of beams snapping, scrambling into the storm to save what they could. Some rebuilt quickly with frozen hands. Others sought shelter in neighbors' homes, crowding into one room where 20 people might sleep shoulder to shoulder just to share body heat. Water was a constant battle. Wells were sealed in ice, buckets cracked in the cold, and snow had to be gathered daily, melted pot by pot, just to drink. Children carried heaps of it inside, giggling as it vanished into steam, but their parents saw only the endless work. Each sip of water was earned with hours of bending, lifting, waiting. Food was no longer about choice. It was survival math. Could one loaf of bread stretch for 3 days? Could beans boiled twice still give strength? Families turned to whatever they had left, potatoes shriveled in cellars, onions sprouting in the dark, dried herbs from summer gardens. Some boiled bones again and again until there was nothing left but weak broth. And yet they ate together, bowed their heads, and gave thanks, not for plenty, but for the fact that there was still something to share. Isolation cut deeper than hunger. Roads vanished. Rail lines froze. Mail stopped for weeks at a time. The only voices many settlers heard outside their own family were carried on the wind. Cabin fever became real. Small rooms filled with restless children, anxious parents, and the weight of silence. Arguments flared over nothing, then softened with apologies, because they knew they couldn't afford division when unity was their only strength. But even in the harshest nights, there were moments of unexpected grace. The sky above, free of city smoke, revealed a blanket of stars so sharp and bright it seemed the universe itself leaned closer to watch. Sometimes, faint northern lights shimmered in green and purple waves, and settlers stepped outside despite the cold, their breath hanging in the air, just to marvel at the silent beauty. For a few minutes, the prairie didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a cathedral. Children, resilient as ever, turned the snow into their playground. They dug tunnels, built forts, and slid on makeshift sleds cobbled from barrel staves or broken boards. Their laughter carried across the drifts, a sound so rare and pure that parents stood in doorways, smiling through their weariness. Joy, however brief, was a rebellion against despair. And through it all, the fire remained the center of life. Families sat close, mending clothes, telling stories, sipping weak tea or hot milk when they had it. The fire's glow was more than warmth, it was identity, memory, the stubborn refusal to give in. Every log burned was a victory. Every night survived was proof they were still here. The settlers didn't know how long the storm would last, but they knew this. As long as the fire burned, as long as someone whispered hope, as long as laughter rose even once in the night, winter could not defeat them. By late January, the settlers knew their shelves would not last. The barrels that once brimmed with corn and flour now scraped empty. The salted pork that had been rationed so carefully was gone. Even beans, that humble staple, were running low. Hunger became a daily companion, gnawing not just at the belly but at the spirit. Meals shrank into whispers of food. A thin porridge made from cornmeal, stretched with melted snow. A weak broth, flavored by bones already boiled 3 times. A crust of bread softened over steam to make it seem more than it was. Mothers became magicians, turning scraps into sustenance, while fathers often pretended they weren't hungry so children could eat first. How many nights did a parent go to bed empty, smiling at their children to hide the ache inside? Neighbors, too, leaned on one another. When a family ran out of flour, another offered half a sack. When one had nothing but onions left, they traded for dried venison or a jar of fruit preserves saved from better months. Every gift mattered, not just for survival, but as proof that no one stood alone. Children noticed the changes. They asked why their bowls were smaller, why stew no longer smelled the same. Parents told them spring was coming, that the land would give back soon. But in private, those same parents stared at the snow outside and wondered how much longer could they hold out. Isolation only deepened the fear. The railroads that settlers had trusted for supplies froze under drifts higher than a man. Trains never came. The roads were buried, wagons useless. There was no help, no store, no distant town to rely on. The prairie had swallowed all paths. Each cabin became its own island, floating in a sea of white. And yet, even in this desperate season, resilience showed itself in unexpected ways. A child laughed while catching snowflakes on her tongue. A father told old stories by the fire, his voice soft but steady, weaving memories of summers past. Quilts, stitched from scraps, became symbols of survival, each patch a reminder of endurance through other hard times. Some nights, when the wind calmed and the sky cleared, families stepped outside, staring at the endless stars. The silence of the prairie was complete, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow. It was in that silence that settlers found strength. The same vastness that threatened them also humbled them, reminded them they were part of something bigger than hunger, bigger than winter. And so, they carried on, one day at a time, one meal at a time, one shared act of kindness at a time. Hunger might tighten its grip, but the settlers tightened their grip on each other, holding on fiercely to hope. Because in Dakota, in the hard winter of 1880, hope was the one resource they could not afford to lose. The longer the winter dragged on, the more desperate became the journeys beyond the cabins. By February, shelves were bare in many homes, and even the most careful families had little left but scraps. To survive, someone had to leave the fragile safety of the cabin and step into the vast, merciless white. But out there, the land was a trap. Snowdrifts swallowed fences whole. Roads no longer existed. Even the rail lines, once thought to be lifelines of supply, were buried so deep under ice that they seemed like relics of a forgotten world. For anyone setting foot outside, each step was a gamble with death. And yet, settlers did it. Fathers pulled on heavy boots, scarves wound tight across their faces, and mittens stitched thick but clumsy. Mothers, too, sometimes took the risks, knowing the children inside needed more than hope to carry them through another week. Horses were led from barns, steam rising from their nostrils as they stepped hesitantly into the drifts, their hooves sinking deep. The silence of the prairie was deceptive. It wasn't calm, it was dangerous. The snow muted every sound, swallowing voices, footsteps, even the creak of leather harness. One could walk only a few yards and feel lost, the horizon blurred into a seamless sheet of white. Ropes were tied from cabin doors to barn posts so settlers could find their way back. Without them, even the short walk for firewood could end in tragedy. Still, journeys to neighbors or distant towns had to be made. Sometimes it was for flour, beans, or a handful of coffee grounds. Other times, it was simply for news. Was anyone else surviving? Were trains coming? Had relief wagons left the east? The absence of information was as brutal as the hunger itself. Travelers wrapped themselves in every scrap of warmth they owned. Wool coats patched from old blankets, scarves knitted years earlier, mittens so thick they made rains difficult to hold. Underneath, layers of shirts, dresses, and stockings were stacked, each one trying to ward off the inevitable bite of wind. And then they walked or rode straight into a wall of snow. The wind was merciless. It slashed across exposed skin, stung eyes until tears froze on lashes, and drove needles of ice through even the heaviest layers of cloth. A man's beard would freeze solid in minutes, clumps of frost hanging heavy against his chin. Horses bowed their heads and pressed forward, hooves crunching on unseen ground, nostrils flaring with the effort of each step. Inside the cabins, families waited. Mothers paced slowly, stoking fires again and again, pretending calm so the children wouldn't see the fear on their faces. "Papa will be back," they whispered, though the hours dragged on and the winds outside roared like a beast that had no end. Children listened for hoofbeats in the snow, imagining the moment when the door would burst open and a father would stumble in, arms heavy with food, his face raw from cold but smiling. But not every journey ended that way. Some men never returned. Some horses collapsed under the weight of snow and never rose again. The prairie swallowed them in silence, their absence noticed only when hope itself began to fade in the cabin. And yet, the journeys continued. Because what choice was there? On the rare days when the wind calmed, neighbors would meet along fence lines, their breath clouds mingling in the cold air. Exchanges were made, half a sack of flour for a small jar of dried fruit, a strip of venison for onions. Each gift was a lifeline, a reminder that even scattered across the frozen prairie, they were bound together. Children sometimes joined these shorter trips, bundled so heavily they could barely move, scarves wrapped until only their eyes showed. They stumbled through the drifts with small sleds, hauling back wood or a few supplies. Their laughter, muffled by wool and snow, was one of the few bright sounds in a season otherwise dominated by wind and silence. And when night came, those who had returned alive sat close to the fire, boots thawed slowly by the stove, steam rising as the ice melted. Frost-bitten fingers were rubbed until they stung, and faces raw from wind were soothed with cloths warmed by firelight. Food, however little, was shared. And stories were told of near misses, of roads invisible under the drifts, of the prairie wind whispering like voices of ghosts across the fields. Even in exhaustion, these tales mattered. They became proof that survival was possible, that courage meant walking straight into the storm and finding the way back home. And for the children listening, wide-eyed in the firelight, those stories planted seeds of resilience that no winter could ever freeze. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the settlers clung to one another, warmed not only by fire, but by the unbreakable truth that they would not give up. No matter how many journeys the storm demanded, no matter how brutal the cold, they would keep walking into the white, because life was waiting on the other side. The prairie in the winter of 1880 was a place of endless trial. Hunger pressed against stomachs, cold gnawed at bones, and silence stretched so far that even the strongest hearts faltered. But within that relentless hardship, there were moments brief, fragile, almost miraculous, that carried families forward. Moments of joy, of beauty, and of laughter that no storm could erase. For the children, snow was not always an enemy. Wrapped in layers so thick, they moved like little bundles. They burst from cabins into the drifts whenever the wind calmed. Their laughter rang across the stillness, high and bright, echoing like bells through the frozen world. What adults saw as danger, children turned into playgrounds. They dug tunnels through the drifts, carving secret passageways and hidden chambers. To their imaginations, these snowy hollows became castles, forts, or caves where stories unfolded. One group of children might claim a mound of snow as their mountain, defending it with snowballs made of packed powder. Another might crawl inside a tunnel and whisper tales of bears or bandits waiting in the white. Parents, standing in cabin doorways, watched with quiet relief. The sound of laughter was medicine. It pushed back the silence of the prairie and reminded them that the human spirit, even in the youngest, could turn hardship into play. When cheeks turned too red and mittens grew stiff with ice, the children rushed back inside. Boots dripped onto wooden floors, scarves were unwound, and steam rose from damp coats drying near the stove. They collapsed onto quilts, faces glowing, hair damp with melted snow, and told stories of their adventures in the drifts. Their joy filled the room more than the fire ever could. But joy wasn't reserved only for children. Adults too found fleeting pleasures in the harsh season. On moonlit nights, the prairie transformed into something otherworldly. The snow, spread across miles without end, shimmered silver under the pale light. Every drift glowed as though sprinkled with diamonds. Every tree wore a coat of frost that glistened faintly in the dark. Settlers often stepped outside just to witness it. Wrapped in coats and scarves, they stood still, listening to the silence and watching the world sparkle. Breath turned to clouds that hung in the still air, and the crunch of boots was the only sound. Some said the prairie under moonlight felt holy, a cathedral of light and silence, where the harshness of the day gave way to awe. Inside, families shared small joys of another kind stories. Parents told children about summers past, about rivers running free, and fields waving with tall grass. They recounted adventures from their own youth, stories of courage, foolishness, and love. The children listened wide-eyed, the flicker of firelight painting shadows across their faces. In those moments, hunger was forgotten, and the cold outside seemed distant. Neighbors, too, played their part. On days when weather allowed, someone might trudge across the drifts with a bundle tucked under their arm, half a loaf of bread, a jar of beans, or even a simple letter. The exchange was small, but the act was enormous. A knock at the cabin door, a familiar face appearing from the white, was enough to lift spirits for days. Even animals added to these bright spots. Horses nuzzled children with warm muzzles, their breath puffing white into the air. Dogs bounded through the snow, chasing invisible scents, their tails wagging with endless energy. Cats curled by the fire, purring with satisfaction, as if reminding their humans that comfort still existed. And then there was music. In some cabins, a fiddle or harmonica rested on a shelf. When the nights grew too heavy, someone would play. The notes, thin and trembling at first, grew steady as the room filled with sound. Families sang softly, voices blending with the crackle of the fire. Even if bellies were empty, hearts felt full. Music was not food, but it nourished something deeper, the will to keep going. There were also moments of beauty, so subtle they almost went unnoticed. Frost etched delicate patterns across windows, lace-like swirls catching the morning sunday. Icicles hung from eaves like glass daggers, glittering faintly in the weak light. Children traced these wonders with fingers, imagining them as treasures, as jewels left behind by the cold itself. Parents paused, too, marveling at the artistry of nature, fragile and fleeting, yet undeniably real. Every small joy was a kind of rebellion against the winter. A loaf of bread shared, a letter read by firelight, a night of laughter, or the quiet majesty of moonlight. On snow, these were not luxuries, but lifelines. They reminded settlers that they were more than victims of a storm. They were families, neighbors, and communities holding fast to hope. The hard winter of 1880 demanded everything from those who endured it, but it never succeeded in taking away their capacity to marvel, to laugh, to sing, and to find beauty even in the bleakest days. And perhaps that was the greatest survival tool of all. Not just strength, but joy. Out on the Dakota prairie in the winter of 1880, communication was almost impossible. Roads were buried, trains halted, and wagons useless against the endless drifts. Weeks passed without a word from the outside world. Families wondered if loved ones hundreds of miles away were even alive, if supplies were coming, if spring would ever truly return. In that silence, a single letter could feel like a miracle. When the weather cleared just enough, a lone rider or mail carrier sometimes pushed across the snow-packed miles, their horse struggling with every step, their body wrapped in furs stiff with frost. The sight of such a figure on the horizon sent entire households rushing to doors and windows. Was it a neighbor, a traveler, or most precious of all, the bearer of letters? Imagine the weight of that moment. The rider dismounted stiffly, knocked the ice from their boots, and reached into a pouch. Fingers numb, they pulled out a folded envelope. The edges crinkled from damp, the ink smudged slightly by condensation. To the settlers, it was not just paper. It was proof of connection, proof that beyond the endless white, someone remembered them. Families often gathered around as the letter was read aloud. Sometimes the words came from relatives back east, reporting on harvests, marriages, or births. Other times it was simply reassurance. We are well. We pray for you every night. Even the shortest message, just a few lines, was enough to stir tears. Children leaned in close, eyes wide, not always understanding every word, but feeling the weight of them. Parents read slowly, their voices soft, savoring each phrase. Then the letter was passed around, touched, traced, even kissed. It might be read 10, 20 times before being folded carefully and tucked away, a treasure more valuable than gold. When letters carried bad news, the impact was heavier still. Word of sickness or death traveled slowly, but when it arrived, it carved into hearts. And yet, even then, families clung to the comfort that they had at least been remembered, that their existence was tied to others far away. Grief felt less lonely when written words bridged the miles. News didn't always come on paper. Sometimes it was carried mouth to mouth, passed by neighbors who trudged across fields just to share a scrap of information. A birth announced, a cow lost, a small shipment of flour expected in town. Each piece, no matter how mundane, carried weight. In isolation, even the smallest detail became sustenance for the imagination. When a newspaper finally arrived, though often weeks old, it was devoured like a feast. Families read about events in Chicago, New York, even Europe, marveling at how the world beyond the prairie kept spinning while their own felt frozen in place. Children crowded around as adults read aloud, their voices filling the cabin with far-off stories, politics, inventions, wars. For a moment, the Prairie family felt connected to something vast and alive. Neighbors sometimes shared newspapers from cabin to cabin, the paper growing thin and worn from so many hands. Margins filled with notes, recipes copied down, even doodles from restless children. That sheet of print, once casual and ordinary, became a community artifact, carrying ideas and companionship through the endless storm. Letters were more than information. They were warmth. They lit up rooms, just as surely as the fire in the stove. They gave children something to dream about, parents something to hold on to, and families a reminder that their world, though buried in snow, was not forgotten. And here lies the truth. Survival was not only about bread, meat, and firewood. It was about spirit. Without hope, the will to endure faded. And in that frozen winter, letters were hope made, tangible. They were the soft whisper across miles of storm. You matter. We wait for you. Hold on. When food was low, when the woodpile dwindled, and when the snow showed no sign of stopping, many settlers reached for something they could not see, but could deeply feel: faith. On the Dakota prairie, religion was not a matter of formality. It was survival. Cabins turned into chapels. On Sunday mornings, or any morning that felt like Sunday, when days blurred together, families gathered around the hearth. A father or mother read aloud from a tattered Bible, its pages yellowed and edges curled from years of use. Candles flickered on rough-hewn tables, casting soft light over bowed heads. Children fidgeted, dogs curled at feet, and mothers hushed infants. The words of Scripture drifted into the cabin air like warmth itself, words that promised endurance, redemption, and the hope of spring. Sometimes, when weather allowed, neighbors trudged through waist-deep snow to gather in a larger cabin or tiny schoolhouse. The journey itself was an act of faith, faces stung by wind, lungs burning from cold, but arriving among familiar voices filled hearts with courage. A hymn, sung softly in unison, could echo louder than any storm. Amazing grace, rock of ages, be still, my soul. Settlers carried these songs in their bones. Sung slowly, sometimes off-key, they became prayers woven into melody. Children, not fully understanding the lyrics, hummed along anyway. their high voices piercing the heavy air. Each note was a reminder. We are together. We are seen. We are not abandoned. Prayer was not confined to Sundays. It lived in daily routines. A whispered plea while lighting the morning fire. Lord, let this flame catch. A muttered blessing over a meager meal. Thank you for enough to eat this day. A cry in the night when a child coughed hard. Please, let them wake in the morning. Some families kept journals, written prayers folded between the lines of weather, reports, and crop notes. Mothers penned verses alongside recipes. Fathers scribbled psalms at the margins of seed catalogs. These weren't lofty words meant for others to read. They were anchors for the soul, small acts of grounding in a world buried beneath snow. And then there were the silences, the prayers without words. When storms howled so fiercely that no voice could rise above, families sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed, hearts speaking in unison. In those moments, silence itself became sacred, a shared offering to something greater than themselves. Religion also brought rituals of light. Families lit candles in windows, tiny beacons against the vast dark, believing they symbolized hope, guidance, or divine protection. Children often asked, "Will God see our candle? Will He know we're waiting?" And parents, voices steady, always answered, "Yes, He will." Faith was also carried in objects, a small wooden cross hung above a bed, a rosary passed down from a grandmother, a hymnal worn smooth by generations of hands. These items were not decorations, they were lifelines. To touch them was to touch history, continuity, and the unbroken chain of belief that stretched far beyond the prairie. But faith was not always easy. There were doubts deep, gnawing doubts whispered in the dark. Why this winter? Why this hunger? Why so long? Settlers argued quietly, sometimes even raged at God. Yet, even anger was a form of connection, proof they still believed someone was listening. And in the morning, they prayed again. For children, religion often showed up in stories. Parents retold tales of Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph surviving famine, or Moses leading his people through deserts. These biblical struggles mirrored their own, teaching that endurance through suffering was woven into the human story itself. Christmas that year was unlike any other. There were no grand feasts, no glittering decorations, yet settlers still carved out space for sacredness. A loaf of bread shared, a candle lit, a hymn sung softly in a frozen cabin. The holiness was not in abundance, but in the sheer act of remembrance. In honoring the belief that even in hunger and cold, the divine was present. And maybe that was the greatest gift faith gave, the ability to see beyond the storm, to believe that after snow would come thaw, after hunger would come harvest, after darkness would come light. That trust, invisible yet powerful, carried families across nights that might otherwise have broken them. Faith in the blizzard was not about grandeur. It was not about sermons in stone churches or choirs in fine robes. It was about survival. It was a whispered psalm in the dark, a candle flickering against frost, a hymn sung off-key by tired voices. It was about keeping hope alive when every visible sign told them to give up. And for those Dakota settlers in the hard winter of 1880, faith became a fire no storm could extinguish. If the men were the muscle of survival, chopping wood, tending to livestock, and breaking paths through the drifts, the women were the heartbeat of the prairie. In the hard winter of 1880, when the snow came down week after week and food grew scarce, it was often the quiet strength of mothers and wives that kept families from unraveling. A woman's day began before dawn. While the cabin was still dark, she was already up, layering clothes against the cold striking flint to coax flame into kindling. The smell of smoke curled into the room, signaling to the children that warmth would soon return. By the time the men stirred, the stove was alive, water was warming, and a pot of porridge was thickening. Meals were simple, sometimes nothing more than cornbread crumbs softened in broth, but women stretched every ingredient like magicians. A few beans became soup. Scraps of meat flavored a stew that could feed 6. Dried apples, rationed carefully, turned into a sweet treat on holidays. Every bite carried her touch, a reminder that even in hunger, she could still give comfort. The chores never stopped. Quilts needed mending, boots patched, candles poured, herbs steeped for medicine. Children cried from cold or hunger, and it was the mother who held them, rocking gently in rhythm with the howling wind. Her lullabies were not elaborate, just simple hums passed down from her own mother. Yet in those soft sounds lay reassurance. We will endure this together. When sickness crept in, as it often did in the damp chill of the cabin, women became nurses. They mixed herbal teas, laid cloths against fevered brows, and whispered prayers through long nights. They kept watch over coughing children, soothing frightened little ones while hiding their own fear behind steady hands. But women's strength was not only in care, it was in sheer endurance. They hauled water from half-frozen wells, carried firewood, shoveled paths when men were away, and walked miles through snow to check on neighbors or deliver food. Their skirts, heavy with frost, dragged at their legs, but still they moved forward. And perhaps most of all, they bore the emotional weight. When food ran low and men stared silently at dwindling supplies, it was often the woman who broke the tension with words of encouragement. We'll make do, we always have. The children must see us steady. She could not change the storm, but she could change the spirit within the walls of her home. Stories tell of women who stitched quilts from rags until their fingers bled, who spun yarn by firelight to keep children clothed, who stood outside in blizzards, shaking rugs just to clear filth from the home. Some learned to hunt small game, to trap rabbits, or to skin animals when necessity demanded. Survival blurred the lines between traditional roles, yet women carried these new burdens without complaint, knowing each effort meant life for their families. Even moments of tenderness bore their mark. A scarf knitted from leftover wool, a toy carved from scraps of wood and wrapped carefully for Christmas. A song sung softly at night when the children cried from hunger. These gestures were not small. They were lifelines of the soul. Neighbors remembered them too. Women often crossed the prairie in pairs, visiting a sick friend, bringing broth or bread, sharing what little they had. They traded recipes, whispered advice, swapped remedies. Sometimes they simply sat together, sipping weak tea, holding hands, and sharing silence. That solidarity mattered as much as food or fire. In diaries of the time, entries from prairie women speak of fatigue so deep it ached in the bones. Yet again and again, they wrote of gratitude for a child's smile, for a husband's safe return from the barn, for a patch of blue sky after weeks of gray. Their resilience was stitched into words, just as it was stitched into every quilt they made. And in the darkest nights, when storms raged and children whimpered in fear, women told stories. Tales of summers past, of green fields, of harvest feasts, of laughter ringing across meadows. Their voices painted warmth and color inside cabins buried in snow. In those stories lived the promise of seasons yet to come, keeping children's hope alive. The hard winter of 1880 tested everyone, but for women on the prairie, it was more than a test of endurance. It was a testament of spirit. They were the steady hands that lit the fire, the patient hearts that calmed the frightened, the quiet warriors who turned scarcity into sustenance. Without them, the prairie might have broken. With them, it endured. And their strength, though rarely written in history books, became the invisible thread that stitched survival through one of the harshest winters ever recorded. For all the hardships of that hard winter, the children of the Dakota prairie carried both the heaviest burden and the brightest light. They were small bodies wrapped in layer upon layer of wool, patched coats, and hand-knit scarves, but inside them was a resilience that sometimes outshone even the adults. Their mornings began like everyone else's, with the sting of cold air in their lungs as they tumbled out from beneath quilts. The first rush to the stove was a ritual, tiny hands stretching toward the iron heat, cheeks flushed red. Breakfast was rarely enough to fill their bellies, but they learned early that a few spoonfuls of porridge or a crust of bread had to last. Hunger became an ordinary companion, yet children still laughed. Chores waited for them the moment boots were pulled on. Some carried kindling, others brushed snow from paths or held lanterns, while older siblings fetched water from frozen wells. The snow drifts were taller than many of them, but they trudged bravely, their small footprints pressed alongside their parents'. Even the smallest hands were given purpose, and in that purpose they found pride. But hardship was not all they knew. Children invented joy even in scarcity. They slid down snowy hills on pieces of wood or tin. They built forts from drifts, carving tunnels that sparkled in sunlight. When storms cleared, their laughter rang across the frozen fields like a melody stronger than the wind. To parents listening from cabins, those sounds were not mere play. They were proof that the spirit of childhood could survive even the worst winter. Education did not stop, though schoolhouses were often buried in snow or too far to reach. Mothers became teachers by firelight, guiding little fingers across slates, reciting lessons, reading from the Bible or the rare book that had been carried across the plains. Children squinted in flickering candlelight, memorizing words, adding sums, tracing letters with determination. Learning was slow, but it was steady, and perhaps more precious because it had to be fought for. They also learned through observation. Watching fathers mend tools, mothers patch clothing, or older siblings chop wood taught them lessons no classroom could. Endurance, patience, ingenuity. The prairie was a school of survival, and every child was enrolled. Yet there was fragility too. Illness swept quickly through cabins, and children's small bodies struggled against fever and cough. Mothers stayed up through nights, holding them close, whispering comfort, praying against the howling storm outside. Some did not make it through the winter, and those losses carved wounds that never fully healed. The memory of a child's laughter, silenced too soon, haunted many families long after spring thawed the snow. Still, those who survived carried memories that shaped their entire lives. They remembered pressing noses against frosted windows, marveling at ice patterns like magical forests. They remembered the taste of rare treats, a spoonful of molasses, a dried apple slice saved for Christmas. They remembered sitting close to siblings, sharing warmth beneath heavy quilts, whispering stories into the dark until sleep carried them away. Even pets became companions of comfort. Children clutched cats against their chests, stroked the ears of dogs curled at their feet, or whispered secrets to horses in the barn. Animals offered a kind of friendship that did not ask questions, only shared warmth. Neighbors' children played together when paths were clear. Bundled in endless scarves and mittens, they carried small gifts across snow: a carved toy, a bundle of twigs, a drawing on rough paper. These exchanges kept friendships alive, reminding them that even in isolation, they were not alone. When storms howled fiercest and the world outside vanished in white, children relied on imagination. They turned shadows into dragons, sparks from the stove into shooting stars. They asked endless questions. When will spring come? Will the snow ever stop? And parents, even when unsure themselves, answered with steady voices, "Soon, my love. We'll get through this together." In truth, the children carried the hope of the prairie. Their laughter broke through silence. Their curiosity softened despair. Their survival gave meaning to every sacrifice their parents made. In diaries, settlers wrote not only of snow and hunger, but of the resilience of their children, their ability to find wonder in frost, to turn chores into games, to hold tightly to joy even when the world outside was unforgiving. The winter of 1880 was brutal. It scarred families and tested endurance. But the children, in their innocence and persistence, became living proof that even in the harshest cold, warmth could be found in laughter, in play, in the simple courage of growing up on the frozen prairie. They were not just children of the storm, they were its answer. And their spirits, fragile yet unbroken, lit the path through one of the darkest winters the Dakota plains ever knew. On the Dakota prairie in that hard winter of 1880, survival was not only about what happened inside a single cabin. It depended just as much on the quiet web of care stretching between neighbors scattered across miles of frozen land. Even when snow buried fences, when trails vanished under drifts, and when the wind seemed to erase every footprint by morning, settlers found ways to hold each other up. Every act of generosity carried weight. A few sticks of firewood shared across a snow-packed path could mean the difference between warmth and bitter cold. A jar of dried beans, a loaf of bread, or a pouch of flour passed through a neighbor's doorway might carry a family through one more week. People didn't think of these as grand sacrifices. They saw them as necessities, small threads woven into the fabric of survival. It wasn't only food and fuel. Sometimes what people needed most was reassurance, and that could arrive in the form of words spoken quietly at a doorway. A father, his beard rimed with frost, would pause at a neighbor's fence to say, "We'll get through it. Spring will come." Those words, simple as they were, gave strength. On the prairie, encouragement was as vital as bread. Children played their part too. Mittens clumsy, boots heavy with snow, they trudged through drifts, carrying little bundles their parents had packed cornmeal wrapped in cloth, a handful of dried apples, or even a note scribbled on paper. They returned with treasures of equal value: a carved toy, a knitted scarf, or sometimes just the warmth of being welcomed into another cabin for a moment. Their deliveries were lessons in both hardship and kindness. Not every family had much to give. Some lived on the edge of desperation themselves. But settlers learned that generosity wasn't measured only in what could be handed over. It was also in what could be shared, an extra place by the fire, a story told to lighten hearts, or the simple act of sitting together while storms raged outside. Loneliness was just as dangerous as hunger, and neighbors knew that breaking isolation was a form of survival. When weather allowed, men traveled by sled or horseback across frozen fields, faces wrapped in scarves, to deliver mail or news. These trips were exhausting, sometimes dangerous, but they tied cabins together like beads on a string. A single letter from a relative hundreds of miles away could lift spirits in a way no amount of stew could. It reminded settlers that they belonged to a larger world, one that hadn't forgotten them. There were also the quiet acts of watchfulness. Neighbors kept an eye on each other's smoke. If no smoke rose from a chimney for too long, someone would fight their way through snow to knock on the door just to make sure all was well. Sometimes that knock arrived just in time when sickness had spread through a cabin or when supplies had run out sooner than expected. These ties of care weren't only about kindness, they were about identity. On the prairie, people understood that their lives were bound together. No one could claim full independence in the middle of such relentless cold. Strength was found not in going alone, but in reaching out. Think of the image: a man pulling a sled piled with wood through waist-high snow, leaving a trail of deep prints behind him. A woman handing over a jar of preserved fruit with both hands, her eyes shining with quiet relief. Children running between cabins, their laughter muffled by scarves. These weren't scenes of luxury. They were survival itself, painted in the small strokes of generosity. At night, when families returned to their own hearths, they felt warmer not just because of the fire. They felt the presence of others, knowing that across the dark, snowy expanse, a neighbor had thought of them, had carried wood, had spoken kind words, had risked the storm to deliver news, made the howling wind feel a little less sharp. The Dakota prairie was vast, harsh, and unforgiving, but within that frozen wilderness lived a community stitched together by care. Survival was not just a personal triumph, it was a collective one. And the memory of that winter, for those who lived through it, was not only of hunger and cold, but of the strength found in one another. Because in truth, the hardest winter taught a lesson that echoed long after the snow melted. The land could strip a family of food, firewood, even hope. But as long as neighbors remembered each other, no storm could strip away humanity itself. When food grew scarce and storms piled snow higher than a man's chest, settlers clung to more than just their firewood and quilts. They leaned on faith. Out on the Dakota prairie, where churches were few and miles apart, religion wasn't confined to a steeple or a Sunday. It lived inside cabins, around kitchen tables, beside the stove, where frost rhymed the windows and the wind moaned like a restless spirit. Families read from the Bible by candlelight, voices hushed but steady. Children, drowsy beneath quilts, listened to words about endurance, patience, and providence. For parents, those verses weren't only ritual. They were reminders that hardship had meaning, that even the bleakest nights belonged to a story larger than themselves. Some settlers came from Lutheran or Methodist traditions. Others were Catholic, still others Baptist. But labels mattered less than the comfort those old words brought. A single psalm could silence the storm in a man's chest, even while snow rattled the shutters. A hymn sung in shaky harmony could warm a cabin more than an extra log on the fire. Neighbors sometimes gathered when the weather allowed, trudging through drifts to share worship. Imagine it: boots heavy with snow, scarves stiff with frost, men and women crowding into a cabin too small for the bodies it held, shoulders brushing, breath rising in visible clouds. Someone would read a passage, someone else would hum a hymn, and soon the whole room would join in, voices blending with the crackle of the fire. There was no organ, no pews, no polished altar. Just wooden chairs, rough walls, and a single lantern casting golden light. But in that setting, faith felt raw, intimate, and unshakable. People didn't need grandeur. They needed reassurance that they were not alone, that God's hand hadn't abandoned them to the storm. Prayer carried a special power. Parents prayed over children's fevered foreheads, over dwindling food supplies, over frozen wells. They prayed for neighbors whose chimneys smoked less often, a sign of trouble. They prayed not for riches or ease, but for endurance, for just enough to keep going until the thaw. Faith wasn't only spoken, it showed itself in actions. In the decision to share half a loaf of bread instead of hoarding it, in the quiet patience of a father chopping wood in sub-zero cold because he believed tomorrow was worth preparing for. In the songs, mothers sang softly while sewing patches by candlelight, reminding their children that beauty and hope could still exist in a world buried in snow. Children absorbed it all. They learned that prayers weren't magic spells, but steady reminders of strength. They watched their parents bow heads before every meal, even if that meal was no more than thin stew and hard bread. They saw how gratitude, even in scarcity, softened fear. For them, religion wasn't distant. It was alive, stitched into daily survival. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, settlers would step outside and look up at the stars, so sharp against the black sky they seemed within reach. In those moments, it was impossible not to feel awe. Some whispered prayers right there under the heavens, feeling small but not forgotten, wrapped in a universe vast and enduring. Faith also helped families hold on to memories of home. German settlers remembered hymns from their childhood churches. Norwegian families sang carols in their mother tongue at Christmas, voices trembling but firm. Irish families recited prayers that had crossed oceans with them. Those rituals tied them not just to God, but to generations before who had endured other hardships and survived. And when Christmas came in that hard winter, though presents were rare and tables sparse, cabins glowed with quiet reverence. Families lit candles, sang hymns, and told the story of Christ's birth. Children's eyes sparkled at the tiny flame reflected in frosted windows. For one night, hunger and cold loosened their grip, replaced by hope. The storms did not relent. The snow did not ease. But faith gave settlers something storms couldn't touch, a sense of meaning, of endurance, of connection to each other, and to something greater. In those long months, it was faith that turned survival into something more than stubbornness. It made it purposeful. And when spring finally came, when snow melted into rivers rushing through the prairie and grass pushed up through thawing soil, settlers remembered. They remembered not just the hunger, not just the cold, But the prayers whispered in darkness, the hymns sung against the wind, the sense that even in the hardest winter, light had never fully gone out. Because faith, in the end, was not just about religion. It was about resilience, about the belief that no matter how relentless the storm, the human spirit, steady, patient, hopeful, could endure. While parents measured out rations and worried over frozen wells, children faced the hard winter of 1880 with very different eyes. To them, snow wasn't only hunger and hardship. It was also playground, canvas, and endless possibility. And in that way, the youngest settlers became the keepers of joy, the ones who reminded weary adults that even in the hardest season, life could still be bright. Cabins often grew cramped during long stretches of storm. Walls closed in, air grew heavy with smoke and stew, and tempers sometimes frayed. But a child's laugh could cut through the heaviness like sunlight through clouds. Even when bellies ached from thin meals, children found ways to play. A wooden spoon became a horse. A rag doll stitched from scraps became a queen. Buttons were tokens, sticks were swords, and firewood chunks were blocks for castles. When the wind eased and the snow lay fresh and deep, the outdoors became their kingdom. Bundled in mismatched coats, scarves pulled up to their eyes, mittens too big for their hands, children tumbled into drifts. They dug tunnels, carving out secret chambers where whispers echoed like grand adventures. They built forts from snow piled high, defending them with shouts that rang across the frozen prairie. To parents listening from doorways, those shouts were sweeter than any hymn, proof that childhood could outshine hunger. Sleds were crafted from whatever scraps could be. Spared boards smoothed with knives, bits of rope tied to the front. With squeals of delight, children dragged one another across packed snow, the runners creaking, bodies tumbling into heaps of laughter. Sometimes, even adults couldn't resist. A father might take a turn, sliding down a small hill while his children cheered, his own laugh surprising him after weeks of worry. Snow itself became toy and teacher. Children pressed shapes into drifts, angels, animals, sometimes just patterns of their boots. They caught flakes on their tongues, giggling at how they vanished instantly. A miracle that never grew old. They sculpted figures with mittened hands, tiny snowmen decorated with twigs for arms and bits of cloth for hats. Each creation was fragile, melting or blown away, but for a moment it brought pride and joy. Inside, when cold forced them back, imagination carried on. Quilts draped over chairs became caves. Shadows on walls turned into stories. With a few sticks and a bit of twine, older children whittled toys for their siblings. A horse that galloped only in the mind. A bird that flew when held to the firelight. These humble creations filled evenings with wonder. Storytelling was the greatest game of all. Parents told tales of their own childhoods back east, of forests without endless snow, of summers with orchards heavy with fruit. Children listened wide-eyed, then spun their own stories of heroes conquering blizzards, of animals that talked, of magical springs waiting just beneath the snow. Around the hearth, imagination blurred hardship into adventure. There was also music. A fiddle might emerge from a trunk, its notes sharp but lively. Or a mother's voice might rise in song, joined by children humming along. The rhythm of clapping hands, the stomp of boots on wooden floors, turned the cabin into a dance hall, at least for a little while. Laughter filled the air. as warm and sustaining as any fire. Even simple chores became play when viewed through a child's eyes. Fetching snow to melt for water turned into contests of who could carry the most. Gathering kindling became treasure hunts. Feeding chickens meant scattering grain like tiny seeds of magic, watching feathers fluff and wings flutter. Adults, weary with responsibility, watched and learned. They saw that children didn't deny the hardship, they simply refused to let it steal their joy. And that joy mattered. It was contagious. A child's giggle lightened the mood at supper. A game of pretend softened the sting of thin stew. Even neighbors, visiting across snowy fields, found their spirits lifted by the sight of children chasing one another in boots too large, scarves trailing like banners in the wind. In many ways, the children were the true resilience of the prairie. They reminded families what they were fighting for. They showed that hope didn't always come from sermons or letters, but from small faces glowing red with cold, from laughter that defied the howl of the storm. As winter stretched on, as shelves emptied and winds refused to quiet, adults clung to those sounds. They were proof that life endured, not just in survival, but in joy. Children, unburdened by adult fears, carried the flame of spirit that kept cabins warm in ways no stove ever could. When spring finally broke the hard winter, it wasn't only the thawing earth that promised renewal. It was the memory of children's laughter echoing through the snow, their play woven into the fabric of survival. Because in the end, the prairie settlers endured not just with grit and prayer, but with the light-hearted resilience of their youngest children of the snow, teachers of joy. In the endless white silence of the Dakota prairie, no family truly survived alone. The hard winter of 1880 was too long, too merciless for any single cabin to withstand without the threads of community woven through it. And so, across miles of drifting snow, neighbors became lifeline. The visits weren't frequent, storms made sure of that. But when the wind eased and the sky cleared, settlers wrapped themselves in wool and fur, tied scarves high, and trudged across the drifts. The journey might take hours, even to reach a cabin just a mile away. Yet those footsteps carved more than paths in the snow. They carved connections. Sometimes the gift was simple: a jar of beans, a handful of onions, a slice of bread wrapped carefully in cloth. Other times, it was firewood stacked by a neighbor's door, a gesture that spoke louder than words. Each offering was given without ceremony, because ceremony required energy they didn't have. Instead, it was done with quiet nods, small smiles, and a shared understanding that survival was never just personal, it was collective. Children carried bundles too, their mittens gripping sacks almost too heavy for them. Their eyes glowed with pride when they handed over food, or when they received in return a carved toy, a scarf, or a handful of dried apples. These exchanges weren't just about calories or warmth. They were about teaching the next generation that generosity could stand against hunger just as strongly as any wall against the wind. Neighbors also shared news: a birth in one cabin, an illness in another, a letter finally delivered after weeks of silence. These words traveled like sparks across frozen land, carrying warmth wherever they landed. Settlers leaned close to hear every detail, their faces lit not only by firelight, but by the reminder that they were not forgotten. And sometimes, what was shared was not a thing, but presence. A father lending his strength to dig out a neighbor's barn door buried in snow. A mother stepping inside another cabin to help calm children while their parents split wood outside. These acts seemed small, but in the rhythm of survival, they were enormous. Even conversations carried weight. Two neighbors leaning against a fence post, breath steaming in the cold, swapping stories of how thin the stew had grown, or how stubborn a cow had been that morning. These words mattered. They reminded everyone that hardship was shared, and that laughter, yes, even laughter could still rise in the middle of hunger. At night, when families returned to their own cabins, they carried more than food or news. They carried reassurance. The prairie might be vast and cold, but people were not alone in it. Every jar exchanged, every log given, every story told was a fire against the long night. And in that way, community became the second hearth of winter. Not the stove of iron and wood inside the cabin, but the invisible hearth of kindness and connection, burning steady in the hearts of those who chose to stand together. Because in truth, the hard winter of 1880 was not survived by grit alone. It was survived by generosity, quiet, steady, and constant, like snow falling over the prairie. When the snow piled higher than the windows and the wind howled without pause, settlers turned to the one thing that even the prairie could not bury: faith. For many, religion was not just belief. It was structure. It was comfort. It was the unseen roof that sheltered them when wood and clay walls trembled under the weight of storms. Cabins became chapels. There were no stained glass windows, no tall steeples piercing the sky. Instead, there was the glow of a stove, the creak of wooden chairs, and families gathered close with heads bowed. The Bible, often worn from years of use, was pulled gently from a shelf. Pages, thin and fragile as frost, whispered when turned. By candlelight, verses were read aloud, words echoing softly against log walls, filling the room with something stronger than heat: hope. Parents spoke in hushed tones, reminding children that trials had always been part of life, and that endurance was both earthly and spiritual. Psalms were sung quietly, voices weaving together like threads of a quilt, each note trembling but steady. Even in the bleakest night, hymns carried a warmth that the wind could not extinguish. Not every settler shared the same faith, but nearly all shared the instinct to look upward when the horizon offered nothing but snow. Some prayed for spring, others for strength. Some simply prayed for the storm to pass quickly. These whispered petitions rose like smoke from the hearth, invisible but felt. There were also moments of doubt. Mothers staring into near-empty cupboards wondered aloud how much longer God would test them. Fathers, exhausted from chopping wood until their hands bled, clenched their teeth against questions they could not voice. And yet, even in those shadows of doubt, faith persisted not as a constant flame, but as embers refusing to die out. Children often saw faith less in sermons and more in gestures, in the way their mother pressed hands together before cutting the last loaf of bread, in the way their father removed his hat before stepping into the biting cold, muttering a quiet prayer for protection. Faith was lived in action, not just spoken. On Sundays, when the weather allowed, neighbors gathered in one another's cabins. The trek through drifts was slow and cold, but the reward was shared prayer, shared songs, and shared strength. A single voice reading scripture became many voices joining together, building a fortress of sound against the silence of winter. And on nights when the aurora shimmered faintly across the sky, some settlers paused to see it not as science, but as a message, a reminder of beauty written across the heavens by the Creator. For them, it was proof that even in the hardest winters, light still danced above the darkness. Faith gave the settlers language for their suffering and courage for their survival. It turned meals into blessings, chores into rituals, and silence into prayer. It told them that hunger was temporary, but endurance eternal. In the hard winter of 1880, firewood and food kept bodies alive. But it was faith, fragile, yet unbroken, that kept their spirits from freezing. Winter hardship was not measured only in hunger or cold. It was measured in coughs that deepened by the day, in fevers that burned hotter than the stoves, and in injuries that would not heal in the frozen dark. Sickness was the uninvited guest that settlers feared most, for medicine was scarce and doctors were often miles away, miles impossible to cross when snow turned trails into graves. A child's cough could rattle through the night, echoing louder than the wind itself. Mothers laid cool cloths across flushed foreheads, whispered lullabies, and prayed as they spooned weak broth into dry lips. Fathers chopped wood harder the next morning, trying to fight helplessness with action. But the truth was simple and heavy. If illness struck hard, there was little anyone could do but wait. When someone fell sick, remedies came from memory, from tradition, from whatever the land still offered. Dried herbs hung above stoves were crushed into teas. Onion poultices were pressed to chests. Honey, if any was left, was stirred into water to soothe throats raw from cold air. These treatments were not always effective, but they were something, and sometimes something was enough to buy time. Injuries, too, became deadly in the deep freeze. An axe slipping in a tired hand, a fall on the ice, even a splinter that turned to infection, all could end in tragedy when no doctor could ride through the drifts. Bandages were torn from quilts, wounds cleaned with melted snow, prayers murmured with every press of a cloth. Families learned to move carefully, deliberately, because even the smallest mistake carried heavy cost. The fear of sickness hung in the air as thick as smoke. Parents worried constantly. Would the cold weaken their children? Would fever spread from cabin to cabin? They knew the nearest town might as well have been another world away. Weeks could pass without outside contact, and news of others' suffering often arrived, too late. And yet, amid this dread, there was resilience. Neighbors risked snow and wind to deliver herbs, or to sit quietly beside a sickbed, offering company when cures ran out. Mothers taught daughters every remedy they knew, preserving not only bodies, but also knowledge. Fathers, who rarely showed weakness, bowed their heads in prayer at night, not ashamed to ask for mercy. Some illnesses passed like shadows, fading slowly until life returned to normal. Others left scars, empty chairs at tables, quilts folded but no longer needed, names spoken in whispers. But even in grief, the settlers carried on. Survival demanded it. The hard winter of 1880 tested not only their stomachs and their strength, but also their ability to endure fear itself. For on the frozen prairie, the silence of snow could be broken by laughter, by prayer, or by coughs that chilled hearts more than the cold ever could. On the frozen Dakota plains, a single cabin might stand miles from the next, swallowed in a sea of white. Yet isolation never meant complete solitude. In the hard winter of 1880, survival often depended on something stronger than food or firewood. It depended on people. Neighbors learned quickly that kindness was as essential as grain or timber. One family short on flour might wake to find a small sack left quietly on their doorstep, a gift carried through drifting snow by someone who had only a little more to spare. A jar of dried fruit, a bundle of kindling, even a half loaf of bread could mean the difference between despair and endurance. Children became small messengers of generosity. Mittens clumsy, boots too big, they trudged across paths carved in the snow, delivering tiny parcels, a wooden toy carved by hand, a scarf knitted from leftover yarn, a drawing scratched on scrap paper. Their gifts were humble, yet they carried warmth that no fire could match. Adults found ways to connect too, even when storms pressed hard. Sometimes it was just a brief word exchanged through a half-opened window or a conversation shouted across a fence line. Encouragement mattered. A reminder that we're all still here had power enough to steady hearts against the endless wind. When weather allowed, families gathered for small moments of fellowship. Perhaps two cabins shared a meal stretched thin but flavored with laughter. Perhaps a neighbor stopped by to mend a tool or trade beans for onions. These interactions, however ordinary, stitched people together like patches in a quilt. Each small act of care became part of a larger design of survival. And when tragedy struck, when sickness lingered too long, or when an accident claimed a life, the community carried that weight together. Men braved the drifts to dig graves, their shovels striking frozen ground with dull, determined rhythm. Women stood side by side, comforting children, singing soft hymns that floated above the howling wind. No one was left to grieve alone. In the stillness of night, families sometimes spoke of their neighbors with gratitude. They remembered the logs delivered when wood ran low, the whispered prayer offered across a frozen yard, the hand that steadied them when despair threatened to take hold. These memories carried them forward as much as food or fire. The prairie was vast, cold, and unyielding, but within it ran invisible threads of human connection, thin as spider silk, strong as steel. Each act of kindness tied one cabin to the next, weaving a fabric of resilience that not even the hardest winter could tear apart. When food ran low and storms refused to break, settlers turned to something less tangible, yet no less vital: faith. Out on the prairie, where the wind erased trails and snow buried familiar landmarks, prayer became both compass and anchor. Many families gathered each evening by the fire, not only to warm their hands, but also to lift their voices in hymns passed down from their homelands. The melodies were simple, but in the hush of the cabin, with the storm pressing against the walls, those words carried power. Children listened with wide eyes, their fears eased by the steady cadence of verses that spoke of light in darkness, of dawn after long night. Bibles, hymnals, or even scraps of paper with memorized verses became treasured possessions. Settlers read by flickering lamplight, the words offering reassurance that their suffering was not without meaning. "This too shall pass," someone would whisper, and the phrase settled like an extra blanket around the room. Churches were rare across the spread of Dakota homesteads, but faith was not bound by walls. On calmer Sundays, neighbors would trudge across drifts, arriving at a cabin where benches or stools had been pulled together. There, a farmer might preach, a mother might lead a hymn, and together they wove a service from what little they had. No grand cathedrals, no stained glass, Only rough walls, shared breath, and conviction that they were not forsaken. Even those less tied to religion found solace in ritual. Lighting a candle, speaking aloud the names of distant loved ones, or simply pausing in silence while watching snow fall through a window, these moments became prayers of their own. The vastness of the prairie made people feel small, but it also stirred a sense of being part of something greater than themselves. And there were tales of settlers who had survived winters before, of ancestors who endured harsher trials, of miracles when hope seemed gone. These stories passed from parents to children like torches, illuminating a path through the cold. Faith did not put food on the table or wood in the stove, but it did something equally necessary. It kept despair from taking root. In the middle of endless white nights, it reminded families that every storm is temporary, that spring waits just beyond the horizon, and that endurance is not just about the body, it is about the spirit. In those frozen months of 1880, the settlers' greatest strength was not only in their axes, their quilts, or their food stores. It was in their belief, fragile at times, fierce at others, that they could outlast the winter because they were not alone. The prairie wind might roar, the snow might bury, but within each cabin there flickered a flame of faith, steady as the morning star. Not every day on the prairie was carried with quiet faith and steady resolve. There were nights when despair crept in like a draft through the cracks, chilling even the strongest hearts. Imagine a mother staring at an almost empty flour sack, knowing her children's hunger would sharpen tomorrow. Or a father, hands cracked and bleeding from chopping wood, realizing the pile was shrinking faster than the storms would pass. There were moments when the snow seemed endless, each storm erasing the work of the last. Roofs sagged under drifts, fences disappeared, and trails vanished into a blank horizon. Some settlers confessed in their journals that the silence of the prairie, broken only by wind, felt like the land itself was conspiring to swallow them whole. How many more weeks could they endure before supplies ran dry? How many more mornings could they wake to the same unrelenting cold? Children, though resilient, were not immune. There were nights when laughter faded, and small voices asked questions no parent could easily answer. Will spring ever come? Why do we always feel hungry? Parents offered soft reassurances, but inside, worry gnawed like the wind at cabin walls. Neighbors helped when they could, but isolation sometimes made it impossible. A family stranded by snowdrifts miles deep might go weeks without seeing another soul. The loneliness was its own trial, as heavy as hunger or frost. In those times, even the sound of a horse's distant hoofbeats or a knock at the door felt like salvation. And yet, even at the brink of despair, settlers discovered reserves of strength they did not know they carried. A father would ration the last of the salt pork, then head into the cold to hunt rabbits, refusing to return empty-handed. A mother, pale with exhaustion, would still find a way to stitch together mittens from scraps of old fabric, because her child's fingers must be protected. Sometimes, strength came from the smallest sparks. A child's drawing on frost glass, a neighbor's unexpected gift of beans, a letter arriving against all odds. These fragments of kindness reignited hope. They reminded families that even if survival felt impossible alone, together they might endure. The prairie tested not just the settlers' bodies, but their very spirit. It stripped life to its barest essentials: warmth, food, shelter, and the will to keep going. And when spirits faltered, it was that last one, the will, that mattered most. Every step through deep drifts, every log split with frozen hands, every thin meal stretched for one more night, was an act of defiance against despair. These were ordinary people, but in enduring the extraordinary, they became something else, symbols of quiet resilience carved into the history of the land. By late January, just when weary settlers thought the storms might ease, the prairie unleashed its full wrath. A blizzard roared across Dakota like a living beast, erasing every boundary between earth and sky. Wind screamed around cabins with a voice so fierce it seemed intent on tearing the very walls apart. Snow slammed against doors and windows in endless waves, a pounding white fury that showed no mercy. Inside, families huddled together, blankets piled high, stoves fed with every scrap of wood they dared to spare. The fire glowed defiantly, but even its warmth seemed fragile, a flickering heartbeat in a sea of cold. Each gust rattled shutters, shook loose boards, and sent fine powder snow sifting through the tiniest cracks. Parents pressed quilts against seams, desperate to keep the storm at bay. Visibility outside vanished. Step 1 foot beyond, door, and the world disappeared into a whirling chaos of white. Men who ventured out to tend animals, tied ropes from cabin to barn so they could find their way back. Even then, the path was treacherous. Snow rose past their waists, and the wind ripped away breath, stinging eyes and skin. Horses trembled in stalls, cows moaned low with unease, and chickens fell silent. The animals, too, seemed to know this was no ordinary storm. For days the blizzard did not let up. Supplies dwindled, water grew scarce, and the endless howling outside gnawed at nerves like a relentless drum. Children tried to stay brave, but some cried quietly at night, muffling sobs into quilts as the cabin shuddered around them. Parents whispered reassurances they barely believed themselves. "It will pass. Just hold on. The sun will return." And then, almost as suddenly as it had come, the fury broke. The wind softened, the pounding eased, and the white roar gave way to silence. Families cracked open frozen doors, blinking into a world remade. Snowdrifts towered higher than men, fences lay buried, and barns were half hidden under gleaming white hills. The prairie looked alien, sculpted into vast dunes and ridges by the storm's wild hand. Yet amid the devastation, there was also awe. The sun returned, casting a brilliance across the snow so bright it hurt the eyes. For the first time in weeks, the settlers breathed without the storm clawing at their lungs. Children clambered over new drifts, their laughter ringing like bells across the hollow stillness. Parents, though exhausted, felt a flicker of pride. They had endured the storm's greatest trial. It had not broken them. If anything, it had carved them sharper, like stone weathered into strength. And though the winter was far from over, the settlers knew something vital. They had faced the worst the prairie could throw at them and survived. When the great blizzard finally passed, Dakota emerged into a silence that was almost heavier than the storm itself. The snow lay deep and unmoving, sculpted into ridges and peaks that swallowed fences, barns, and trails. For miles in every direction, the world appeared as one endless white desert. Dazzling under the cold Sunday, Settlers opened their doors cautiously, stepping into drifts that reached chest height. Some had to dig their way out, carving narrow tunnels from cabin to barn. The work was grueling. Each shovel of snow revealed more snow beneath, a labor that seemed endless. Yet there was no choice. Animals had to be fed, roofs had to be cleared before they collapsed, and firewood had to be fetched from stacks now buried out of sight. Inside barns, horses stamped nervously in the dim light, their coats damp from the closeness of their stalls. Cows stood weary but alive, their eyes reflecting both relief and hunger. Families carried armfuls of hay through the tunnels they dug, scattering it carefully, each wisp precious. Chickens, cramped in small coops, blinked against the sudden burst of light when doors were opened, their feathers fluffed thick against the cold. Every task became twice as hard. Chopping wood meant first uncovering the wood pile, frozen solid beneath ice. Fetching water meant hacking through drifts to reach the well, only to find the bucket clanging uselessly against frozen depths. For many, melting snow in iron pots became the only option, a chore that stole hours from each day. And still, families pressed forward. Children, though tired, laughed when they could, sliding down high drifts or building forts from the very snow that had nearly buried them alive. Their joy was a fragile light in the midst of hardship, reminding everyone that life insisted on carrying on. Parents watched them with both pride and worry, aware that food supplies were shrinking with alarming speed. Neighbors, too, looked for one another after the storm. When the weather calmed enough for travel, men trudged across the blanketed prairie, following ropes, poles, or memory to find nearby cabins. They carried what they could: a sack of beans, a few onions, a small bundle of firewood. These offerings were exchanged with quiet gratitude. Nothing went to waste. Every gift was measured not in its size, but in the spirit of survival it represented. By evening, cabins once again glowed with the steady light of stoves and lamps. Quilts wrapped weary bodies, bowls of thin stew were passed around, and silence settled heavy over the land. Outside, the prairie looked calm, almost beautiful, but inside each family knew the truth. The worst storm had passed, but the long fight was not yet over. There were still weeks of hunger, cold, and waiting ahead. The blizzard had stripped the land bare, but it also left something unshaken: the will of the settlers. They had survived one of the harshest tests the prairie could offer. Now, their task was to endure the rest of winter with the same patience, grit, and quiet determination. As January gave way to February, the prairie still lay buried under its white prison. Snowdrifts towered high against fences, and the cold sank deeper each night, making every task a struggle. But more than the cold, it was hunger that became the settlers' fiercest enemy. Pantries that had once held barrels of flour, sacks of beans, and jars of preserves now looked alarmingly bare. Shelves echoed with emptiness. The once bright jars of pickled cucumbers and tomatoes were long gone, their glass rinsed clean and set aside for spring if spring ever came. Mothers scraped the last bits of molasses from wooden barrels, stretching the sweetness across biscuits no larger than a child's palm. Fathers crushed frozen corn or wheat, grinding it by hand when mills were unreachable. Every meal was an act of ingenuity. Dried apples were boiled into thin, watery stews, sometimes sweetened with just a spoonful of sugar, if any remained. Bones saved from autumn butchering were simmered over and over until they gave nothing but a faint hint of broth. Children slurped eagerly, their eyes wide, as if even the weakest soup was a feast. Neighbors shared what little they had. A man might arrive at a cabin with half a sack of turnips, trading it for a few scoops of flour. Families boiled cattails dug from beneath frozen ponds, roasted prairie roots that tasted bitter but filled the belly, and used lard sparingly, knowing it might be weeks before more could be had. Some even roasted kernels of wheat saved for spring planting, a choice that meant surviving the present but risking the future. Hunger changed people's rhythms. Work slowed as bodies grew weaker. Faces hollowed, eyes sank deeper, and laughter became rare. Yet, even in this hardship, there were moments of grace. Families gathered around stoves in the evenings, passing mugs of weak tea brewed from dried herbs or pine needles. Children hummed soft songs, parents told stories of warmer days, and for a short while, hunger's shadow lifted. What kept them alive was not only food, but faith. Faith in the land, in each other, and in the promise that spring would return. They spoke quietly of the thaw to come, of planting gardens, of green grass pushing through the melted snow. These hopes became nourishment for the spirit, as essential as bread was for the body. Every day was a test of endurance. Every night, a silent prayer that tomorrow would bring relief. The settlers had survived the fury of the blizzard. Now they had to survive the slow, grinding famine it left behind. Hunger weakens even the strongest. By late February, settlers were not only battling empty stomachs, but also the illnesses that come when bodies are starved of strength. Cabin air, thick with smoke and damp clothing, became a breeding ground for coughs and fevers. Children huddled close to fires, their cheeks pale, their eyes dull with fatigue. Coughing fits echoed in the night, sometimes so violent they rattled the walls. Mothers pressed cloths, steeped in pine needle, tea to their children's chests, hoping the warmth would ease the wheeze in their lungs. Fathers, exhausted from chopping wood in bitter winds, coughed until their ribs ached. With little medicine available, families turned to whatever remedies the land offered. Dried sage, onion poultices, even garlic saved from autumn gardens, became weapons in a desperate fight against winter's grip. Weary bones carried heavier burdens. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes, leaving scars that never fully healed. Chores that once took an hour now consumed half a day. Fetching water meant hacking through inches of ice, the bucket heavier than before because every ounce mattered. Carrying wood from dwindling stacks left arms trembling, legs unsteady. Yet in the darkest corners, neighbors leaned on each other. A woman who had just buried her last jar of beans still sent broth to a sick family down the path. Men shared the labor of caring for animals, knowing that one household's horse or cow might be needed by all when spring planting came. There was an unspoken understanding. Survival was not an individual feat, but a shared struggle. Inside cabins, prayers rose as steadily as the smoke from stoves. Families asked for healing, for strength, for just one more day of endurance. They whispered promises to each other that when spring returned, they would plant more, store more, prepare better. Children, though thin and weary, clung to those promises. They listened wide-eyed as parents told stories of summers past, fields heavy with wheat, orchards buzzing with bees, rivers filled with fish. Those stories became medicine too, feeding not the body, but the spirit. Winter was not done with them. More storms still lurked on the horizon. But even as sickness and hunger pressed closer, something unbreakable lingered inside those rough-hewn cabins: the will to keep going. By March, many settlers prayed they had endured the worst. Days stretched a little longer, the sun lingering above the horizon, as if promising that spring was within reach. Snowmelt trickled from the eaves, and for a fleeting moment, families dared to hope. Yet the prairie was not ready to release its icy grip. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind shifted with a sharpness that settlers recognized instantly. "Another storm," they whispered, bracing themselves. The final weeks of winter often struck with the most punishing force, and the storm that swept across Dakota that March was one of those cruel reminders. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in sheets so heavy they blurred the line between earth and sky. Winds roared like a living thing, rattling cabins and tearing at roofs. Doors had to be braced with furniture to keep them from flying open. Families huddled together, quilts pulled tight, as snow piled against windows until daylight itself was smothered. The sound was relentless, like the prairie itself howling in defiance of human endurance. Even the strongest men, hardened by months of chopping wood and trudging through drifts, admitted fear in their eyes. To venture outside was to risk death. Some tried, desperate to save animals or retrieve firewood, only to stagger back half frozen, their eyelashes crusted with ice, their breath like knives in their lungs. Inside, time slowed. Families rationed what little food remained: thin broth, a crust of bread, a sliver of dried meat. The smell of smoke was heavy, as stoves burned hotter and longer to fight the cold. Children lay silently, too weary for games, their small bodies pressed against their mothers for warmth. And yet, amid the roar of wind and the weight of snow, there was a strange kind of stillness inside those cabins. Parents whispered encouragement, reminding their children that storms eventually passed. They had seen it before, and they would see it again. Faith, both in God and in each other, became the anchor when everything else felt uncertain. When the storm finally broke after days of fury, settlers emerged to a landscape almost unrecognizable. Barns had collapsed, fences vanished beneath mountains of snow, and trails disappeared into blank white nothingness. But the people themselves, thin, pale, trembling, were still standing. It was the last great test of that endless winter, a storm that stripped away the final reserves of strength, yet also revealed what survival truly meant: not defiance of the prairie, but endurance beside it. When the final storm drifted away, the land lay buried beneath walls of snow. For days, silence reigned, broken only by the groan of melting ice and the cautious creak of doors opening for the first time in weeks. Then came the sound settlers had been longing for: water. It began as a trickle, a shy drip from icicles hanging on the eaves. Soon, streams of meltwater wove through snowbanks, carving paths along fences and barns. The prairie, so long locked in silence, began to stir. Families stepped outside, blinking in the pale light of early spring. Their boots sank deep into slush, but no one complained. The air, though still cold, carried a softness it had not held in months. Horses lifted their heads, snorting as if they, too, recognized the change. Chickens scratched at thawing ground. Even the prairie wind, once a howling enemy, shifted to a gentler hum. Food was still scarce, but hope filled the gaps hunger had left. Trapped barrels of grain, once thought lost, were dug out from beneath snow. Neighbors, gaunt yet smiling, began to visit again, trudging across slushy fields with offerings of seeds, stories, and laughter. Children's voices returned to the air, bright and sharp against the melting quiet. They splashed in puddles, chased the first birds of spring, and carved miniature boats from scraps of wood to float down icy streams. After months of muffled footsteps and hushed conversations, their laughter sounded like music. For adults, spring brought both relief and reckoning. They counted what had been, lost livestock gone, barns destroyed, friends and neighbors who had not survived the winter. Graves dotted the prairie, simple wooden markers standing stark against the thawing ground. Each one was a reminder of the cost of endurance, but they also looked forward. Seeds were sorted, tools repaired, and plans made for planting. The prairie, harsh as it had been, still promised a future. With every patch of bare earth revealed, the settlers saw not just mud and thaw, but possibility. By April, grass began to push through the softened ground. The first green shoots felt like a miracle. Settlers knelt to touch them, their fingers trembling with both exhaustion and joy. Against all odds, life had returned. And with it, so had they. Thinner, harder, wiser but alive. The hard winter of 1880 had not broken them. It had shaped them, carving resilience into their bones, binding communities together, and proving that even in the longest night, spring would always come. The calendar may have promised that spring was near, but the prairie told a different story. Snow still pressed against cabin doors, drifts as tall as fences, and the wind carried a bite sharp enough to sting even through layers of wool. Families woke each morning with the same silent hope. Maybe today the thaw would begin. But more often than not, the sky opened again, sending down another curtain of white. By this point in the winter, food was not just scarce, it was precious. Every scoop of flour, every slice of dried apple, every thin strip of salted pork was measured and divided with the care of a jeweler weighing gold. Mothers learned to stretch meals with imagination thickening. Thin soups with snowmelt, baking bread from flour mixed with coarse cornmeal, flavoring dishes with dried herbs that reminded them of warmer days. Children noticed the difference. Their bowls weren't as full, their treats came less often, but their resilience shone through in ways that amazed their parents. They turned the hardships into games, counting beans before dropping them into a pot, or racing to see who could carry the most kindling in their little arms. For the settlers, these small moments of laughter were more nourishing than food. And yet, under the surface, worry never left. Men checked their dwindling wood piles, knowing each log burned too quickly. Women looked at their shelves and prayed the jars would last. Neighbors leaned on one another like never before, swapping small amounts of food or firewood, knowing that generosity was the only way anyone would make it through. Nights were the hardest. The wind never seemed to sleep, rattling the shutters, moaning through the eaves, reminding every soul that nature held the upper hand. Families curled under quilts, children pressed close to parents, and the fire was stoked again and again, its glow a fragile shield against the vast, unrelenting cold outside. Still, there were moments of wonder. On clear nights, the stars lit up the sky with such sharp brilliance that the prairie seemed almost holy. The northern lights sometimes shimmered faintly, painting curtains of green and pink across the frozen dark. In those moments, settlers paused. They forgot the hunger, the fear, the aching cold. They saw beauty pure, unshaken, eternal, and it reminded them that even the hardest winters had an end. By late March, the prairie looked more like a frozen ocean than farmland. The snow was layered so high and so hard-packed that fences disappeared. Barns seemed to sink into the drifts, and trails that once guided wagons were completely erased. The settlers lived in a world without clear roads, where every step outside was guesswork. The children, with their endless energy, tried to carve paths by dragging sleds or stomping trails through the drifts. Their laughter rang out, but the adults knew the danger beneath the play. A misstep into a snow-covered hollow could trap a child waist deep, and the bitter wind could turn joy into risk in seconds. Parents watched closely, balancing the need for caution with the need for small bursts of joy in a winter that seemed endless. Inside the cabins, the monotony became as heavy as the snow itself. Days blended into one another. The fire was fed, meals were stretched, animals tended, and then night fell again. To keep spirits alive, families leaned into ritual. Some read aloud from worn Bibles or treasured books carried across the plains. Others told the same stories night after night. Legends of ancestors, old homelands, or summers that seemed brighter in memory than they had in life. Hunger sharpened patience. Meals were smaller now, sometimes just a thin broth with scraps of onion or bone, boiled for hours to coax out every trace of flavor. Children sipped slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were a feast. Parents gave up their shares without complaint, disguising the sacrifice with excuses, "I ate earlier," or "I'm not that hungry tonight." Everyone knew the truth, but no one said it aloud. The animals, too, felt the strain. Horses and oxen pawed at frozen straw, searching for warmth and comfort. Cows gave less milk, and chickens produced fewer eggs. Each animal's survival meant survival for the family, so settlers spared what little feed they could. On the coldest mornings, they broke ice from troughs with axes, their hands raw and stinging, just to give the animals a chance at water. Still, amid hardship, there were glimpses of resilience. Quilts patched and repatched held families close. A neighbor arriving with a small sack of flour could spark tears of gratitude. A letter delivered by a weary rider felt like a miracle. Words from distant kin reminding them that they were remembered, that spring always returned, and that no winter, however long, could last forever. And so they endured, day by day, through a season that tested not only their bodies, but their hearts. The land had fallen silent under the hard winter, but the people refused to let silence break their spirit. They whispered hope into the night, clung to faith in the morning, and measured their strength not in abundance, but in persistence. By early April, the sun hung a little higher in the sky, and for the first time in months, its light felt warm against the skin, but warmth on the prairie was deceptive. The snow was still piled high, frozen solid from layers of storms. The wind no longer howled like a beast, but it carried an icy edge sharp enough to sting the lungs. Settlers stepped outside and saw faint changes that stirred hope. Roofs began to drip steadily, small rivulets tracing down icicles before falling into the snow below. Children ran to catch the droplets in tin cups, laughing at the strange sweetness of water that hadn't been melted on the stove. For them, Even the smallest sign of change felt like magic. But spring on the prairie did not arrive like a gentle guest. It fought its way through, slow and stubborn. Paths that were once solid with ice turned to mud by midday, only to freeze hard again overnight. Wagons that ventured out sank into slush, wheels grinding hopelessly. Boots, once insulated against snow, now carried the weight of mud, caking every step with exhaustion. Inside the cabins, food stores reached their lowest. The salted meat was nearly gone, the barrels of flour scraped down to dust, and beans rationed so thinly that stews resembled little more than flavored water. Families spoke often of gardens, of seeds waiting in sacks, of the first green shoots they longed to see break through the soil. Those thoughts carried them through the hunger. The animals mirrored the settlers' weariness. Horses stood thin, their ribs faintly visible beneath winter coats. Chickens pecked listlessly at the straw, searching for what wasn't there. Yet, there was survival in their eyes, the same determination reflected in the settlers themselves. Every creature endured, waiting for the thaw. And then came the first true crack in winter's grip. One morning, children running to the barn noticed something startling, a patch of earth, dark and wet, peeking through the snow near the south wall where the sun hit hardest. They knelt down and touched it, their small hands trembling with wonder. When they burst into the cabin shouting about the ground, parents couldn't help but smile. That single patch of soil was more than dirt. It was proof. Proof that beneath the endless snow, life was waiting. Proof that the prairie hadn't given up. And proof that even after the hardest winter in memory, spring would come as it always had and always would. As the last drifts of snow slowly melted into streams that fed the prairie soil, the long nightmare of the hard winter of 1880 finally gave way to the gentle hand of spring. The ground, once frozen solid, now softened beneath the weight of water. Patches of green emerged like shy whispers, and with them came the promise of renewal. For the settlers, survival had not been easy. They had faced hunger, endless storms, and the loneliness of miles of snow. Yet, through patience, care, and quiet strength, they endured. Each family had their own story of loss and perseverance, but all shared one truth. Together, they had withstood a winter that tested every ounce of their will. The first shoots of grass were more than just plants. They were symbols of hope, fragile yet unyielding. Children pointed at them in wonder, their laughter filling the air once again, no longer muffled by quilts or drowned by the storm's howl. Parents, weary but grateful, breathed easier as they watched life reclaim the land. And so, the prairie taught its lesson, that every season, no matter how harsh, has its end. That hardship may stretch on longer than we think possible, but warmth always returns. The settlers would carry these memories with them forever, etched into their hearts like frost patterns on a cabin window. Tonight, as you listen, imagine yourself wrapped in that same sense of safety they finally felt when the storms were over. Picture the quiet cabin, the soft glow of firelight, and the hush of a prairie night finally free of the wind's unyielding cry. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders soften. Know that just as those settlers found peace after the hardest of winters, you too can find calm after the struggles of your day. Thank you for walking through this story with me. May it remind you that storms, no matter how fierce, always pass. And may it ease you gently into rest. Good night, my friends. Sleep peacefully, and let tomorrow bring you light, warmth, and renewal, just as the prairie welcomes spring after the long, hard winter.